Every wealthy woman in Black Hollow wanted Riker Boone, and he turned them all down. Then one morning he walked into the general store and asked Delilah Hart, the woman the whole town laughed at, to be his wife. No warning, no courtship, just a quiet, certain question that shook the valley to its bones. The widows went silent. The merchants whispered. And Delilah, who had spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough, stood there with flour on her hands and tears she refused to let fall, wondering if this was real or just another cruelty wearing a kind face. Press like, comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The morning Riker Boone rode into town was the same morning Cora Aldridge had decided, once and for all, that he was going to be her husband. She had arranged everything. The new dress had come in on the Thursday stage, deep green silk, tailored to her figure in a way that announced money without shouting it. She'd told her housekeeper to press it twice. She'd pinned her hair the way her late husband used to call elegant. She'd even arranged with Tom Pruitt at the feed store to have a reason to be near the counter when Riker came in, so the encounter would look accidental, the way these things were supposed to look. Cora Aldridge was 41 years old, owned 400 acres of the best grazing land in the Hollow, and had not once in her life failed to get a thing she set her mind to. She stood near the bolts of fabric and watched the door. Riker came in at 9:15, same as he always did on the first Monday of the month. He was a tall man, not the kind of tall that looks ungainly, but the kind that makes a room feel slightly smaller when he enters it. His coat was plain canvas, worn at the elbows, and he hadn't bothered with a hat despite the October cold. He had a list in his hand, folded twice, and he went straight to the counter without looking around. Cora smoothed her dress and moved toward him. "Mr. Boone," she said. "What a coincidence." He looked at her. Not unkindly. That was the thing about Riker that made the whole situation so maddening. He was never unkind. He just wasn't interested, and he didn't bother pretending otherwise. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "Morning. I was hoping I might see you. I've been meaning to ask whether you'd like to join us for Sunday supper. My cook's been doing remarkable things with venison lately, and I thought—" "That's kind of you," Riker said. "I'll be at the tanner's place Sunday. We're mending fence line." "Fence line?" Cora repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Tom Pruitt behind the counter was studying the ceiling with great interest. "Well," Cora said, "perhaps another time." "Perhaps," Riker agreed and went back to his list. She left before her face could do something she'd regret. Out on the boardwalk, the cold air hit her cheeks, and she stood there for a moment, jaw tight, before walking back to her buggy. She passed Meredith Hale on the way, another widow, younger, with an annoying habit of smiling at everything, and Meredith gave her a look that said she already knew. "He turned you down again?" Meredith asked. "We had a perfectly pleasant conversation," Cora said. Meredith's smile didn't change. "He turned me down in August, and before that he turned down Louise Farrow, and before that he sent Helen Crane's supper invitation back unopened." She tilted her head. "I'm starting to think the man just isn't interested in marrying." "Every man is interested in marrying," Cora said. "It's just a matter of finding the right argument." Meredith laughed, not unkindly, and kept walking. Black Hollow sat at the base of a long valley, wedged between a ridge of red rock to the east and a stretch of scrub oak hills to the west, and it had the particular quality of frontier towns that had survived long enough to grow complicated, which is to say that everyone knew everyone's business, most people had an opinion about it, and a significant portion of any given week's conversation was devoted to who was doing what to whom and whether it was appropriate. Riker Boone was, by any measure, the town's most persistent topic of speculation. He'd come to Black Hollow 11 years earlier with 2 horses, a bedroll, and enough cash to put a down payment on a quarter section of land that everyone agreed was too dry and too rocky to amount to anything. Within 3 years, he'd built the quarter section into a working cattle operation. Within 7, he'd bought 2 adjacent parcels and was running more head than any outfit in the valley. He had 12 men on his payroll, a bunkhouse that didn't leak, and a reputation for keeping his word that had never once been seriously questioned. He was also, as far as anyone could tell, completely uninterested in acquiring a wife. This was not for lack of offers. Cora Aldridge had made her feelings plain through 3 separate channels before attempting the direct approach. Meredith Hale had invited him to every social function the Valley produced for the better part of 2 years. Louise Farrow, who was younger than both of them and considerably more attractive by conventional measurements, had ridden out to his ranch personally with a peach pie and an expression of friendly hopefulness, and come back with only the empty pie dish and a polite but final explanation that Riker wasn't looking to complicate his life just now. The town had its theories. Some said he'd been hurt by a woman back east before he came out. Some said he simply preferred his own company. A few of the more romantic-minded souls suggested he was waiting for someone specific, that he had some private standard he hadn't yet told anyone about. Nobody guessed right. Delilah Hart had been working at the Black Hollow General Store for 6 years. She was 28, with dark hair she kept in a practical braid, and a face that was, if you were being honest, not the kind of face that stopped people on the street. What it did was something more subtle and less remarked upon. It paid attention. Delilah had the particular quality of people who have spent a long time being overlooked. She watched everything. She listened when people forgot she was there. She remembered things. She was also, by the cruel arithmetic of Black Hollow's social world, fat. Not simply full-figured, not merely soft. Fat in a way the town had decided was a defining characteristic rather than a simple physical fact. The women in the sewing circle called her poor thing, in voices that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and devastating. The men at the saloon had a nickname for her that she was not supposed to know and did. Children who have not yet learned to wrap their cruelty in politeness, sometimes just pointed. She had learned, over time, to occupy as little social space as possible. She was quiet. She was efficient. She stocked shelves and kept accounts and helped customers find what they needed. And she went home to the 2-room house she rented from the widow Cooper, and she read whatever books came in on the stage, and she did not ask for more than what she had, because she had figured out, somewhere around age 16, that asking for more was a good way to be laughed at. She was behind the counter the morning Riker Boone came in with his list. She watched Cora Aldridge try and fail with her usual composed interest. She'd seen it before, not the specifics of this particular attempt, but the pattern. A woman arrives with a plan. Riker is polite. The plan doesn't work. Delilah processed the transaction with a small private sympathy for everyone involved. After Cora left, Riker came to the counter and handed over his list. "Morning," he said. "Morning, Mr. Boone." She looked at the list. It was neatly written. He always wrote neatly, which she'd noticed years ago. "I can fill most of this today. The linseed oil won't be in until Wednesday." "Wednesday works." She started pulling items. He leaned against the counter in a way that men who are comfortable in their bodies do, not aggressively, just settled. And she worked around him efficiently, setting things on the counter to be tallied. "You got any of that tallow soap left?" he asked. "The kind without the rose smell?" "Yes. Back shelf." She went and got it. "Thank you." She tallied the items, told him the total, took his money, made his change. He put the change in his pocket and gathered the things into his saddlebag. "Miss Hart," he said, and she looked up because that wasn't the usual way he ended a transaction. "Mr. Boone." He looked at her for a moment, not the polite non-look people usually gave her, but an actual direct look, the kind that felt like it was doing something. Then he said, "I'll see you Wednesday for the oil," and left. She stood there for a moment after the door closed, feeling oddly as if something had happened, though she could not have said what. He came back Wednesday for the oil, and on Friday he came back for no stated reason and bought a single tin of tobacco that she was reasonably certain he didn't need because he'd bought tobacco on Monday. She thought, that's strange. She didn't let herself think anything else. He came back the following Monday, which was not his usual pattern. He came back Thursday. He started staying longer at the counter than the transactions warranted, not flirtatiously, not with the kind of loud performance that some men put on, but quietly, talking about nothing in particular. The weather, the fence line at the Tanner place, whether she thought the new road the county was planning would actually get built before winter. She answered him. She was careful not to read too much into it. She had learned that lesson the hard way. At 17, when a boy named Cole Parrish had paid her attention for 3 weeks, and she'd made the mistake of believing it meant what she hoped it meant, and Cole's friends had thought her hope was the funniest thing any of them had encountered that season. She still saw Cole Parrish sometimes, married now with 2 boys, and she was careful to feel nothing about it except a mild and distant relief that it had ended when it did. So she answered Riker and she stocked her shelves, and she told herself it was just a man being friendly, and she went home and read her books. Then one morning in late October, he walked in without a list. She was alone in the store. Walt Briggs, the owner, had gone to talk to the lumber supplier, and Riker came through the door and stood in front of the counter and said, with no preamble whatsoever, "Miss Hart, I'd like to ask you to marry me." The store was very quiet. Outside, a horse shifted its weight on the hitching post. Delilah stood very still with a bolt of muslin in her hands. "I'm sorry?" she said. "I'd like to marry you," Riker said. "If you're willing. I know we haven't... It's not been a courtship exactly. I know that. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I just wanted to ask before I lost my nerve entirely, and I've been losing my nerve for about 3 weeks." She looked at him. He looked back. He was not smiling in the way that meant it was a joke. She'd cataloged that expression on enough faces to recognize it immediately. He looked, if anything, like a man who had made a decision and was now standing beside it whether it felt comfortable or not. Her chest hurt. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're the most capable person I know," he said, "and because you don't perform, and because you've been running that man's accounts better than he knows. And I've watched you deal with people all year, and you're always fair, even when they're not. And..." He stopped. "I know what the town is. I know what people will say. I'm asking anyway." Delilah set the muslin down on the counter. Her hands were not entirely steady. "You've turned down every woman in this valley," she said. "Yes. Women who are, by most measures..." "I know what you're going to say," Riker said, "and I don't think those are the right measures." She was quiet for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked. She thought of Cole Parrish. She thought of the sewing circle women and their sympathetic voices. She thought of being 28 and living in 2 rooms and reading books until she fell asleep because there was nothing else. "I need to think," she said. "Fair enough," he said. "Come back tomorrow." He nodded, picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. She hadn't even noticed he'd taken it off, and walked out. She stood behind the counter for a long time after that, not doing anything in particular. Well, she said yes the next morning, before he had a chance to say anything at all. He looked at her. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm saying yes anyway." Something shifted in his face. Not a big thing, just a small settling like a knot being tied off. "All right," he said. "All right." The wedding was held 3 weeks later at the Justice of the Peace's office, with only Walt Briggs and Riker's foreman Cal Deaver as witnesses. Delilah wore her best dress, which was brown wool and perfectly fine, but not what anyone would have called bridal. Riker wore a clean shirt and the same canvas coat. The Justice of the Peace, a man named Howard Wick, who'd been doing this job for 20 years and had stopped having opinions about people's choices about the 5th year in, said the words. Riker put a plain band on her finger. They shook hands with Howard Wick and walked out into the November cold. "Well," Riker said. "Well," Delilah agreed. You hungry? I haven't eaten since before dawn." "Yes, actually." They went to the diner on the main street, which went very quiet when they walked in. Every head turned. Delilah felt the weight of it like a physical thing, not one big pressure, but a dozen small ones, eyes and the silence where conversation had been. She sat down. She picked up the menu. She studied it as if she were reading it, though she'd eaten here enough times to know it by heart. Riker, across from her, said, "I'll have the beef and the cornbread," to the waitress, and then looked at Delilah like nobody else in the room existed. She ordered the same. The waitress went away. Someone at the counter resumed talking, then someone else, and gradually the room came back to itself, though not entirely. There were still glances. She could feel them. "Does this bother you?" Riker asked. "Being looked at?" "Of course it does," she said. "Okay," he said. Not dismissively, just accepting the truth of it without trying to fix it. Does it bother you? She asked. He considered this seriously. The looking doesn't, he said. What they're thinking behind the looking, a little. Not because I care what they think, because I know what it'll mean for you. She looked at him across the table. Flour tin on the shelf, she was thinking irrelevantly. He bought 2 pounds of flour on Monday. He remembered to say please. I've been managing what this town thinks of me my whole life, she said. I expect I can keep managing it. I expect you can, he said, and meant it. What? The news moved through Black Hollow the way news always moved through small places, faster than was physically explicable, into corners that seemed to have no connection to where it started. By nightfall the day after the wedding, everyone knew. By the following morning, the interpretations had already calcified. Cora Aldridge heard it from her housekeeper, who'd heard it from Tom Pruitt, who'd been at the Justice of the Peace's office for an unrelated matter and had seen the certificate being signed. Cora sat at her kitchen table with her morning coffee and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Delilah Hart. Her housekeeper, who was discreet and long employed and knew better than to comment, said nothing. Delilah Hart, Cora said again, as if saying it a second time might make it make sense. It did not. What made no sense, to Cora and to most of Black Hollow, was not simply that Riker had chosen someone they considered unworthy. That would have been painful but comprehensible. Men made inexplicable choices sometimes. Everyone knew this. What made no sense was that Riker Boone, who had looked at all of them and found them insufficient, had then looked at Delilah Hart and found something worth choosing. It implied a judgment about the metrics by which these decisions were made. It implied that the metrics people had believed in, beauty, land, family name, social standing, were not the ones Riker was using. And if Riker wasn't using those metrics, then the verdict of those metrics, which had always placed women like Cora above women like Delilah, meant something less than it had before. People do not like being told that the ruler they've been measuring by is wrong, especially when they've been winning. Meredith Hale, to her credit, came to a different conclusion. She thought about it for an evening and then told her sister, I actually respect it. I don't know if I would have had the nerve. Her sister looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. Louise Farrow said, loudly and in public, that clearly Riker had lost his mind and someone should check whether he'd been eating bad water. At the saloon, opinions were divided but energetic. The prevailing view among the men was that Riker had made a mistake, and a certain percentage of them believed this with the intensity of people who are slightly threatened by a man doing something that disrupts the established order of things. Only Cal Deaver, Riker's foreman, who had known him for 7 years, said anything that resembled sense. He said it to his wife, in private, and what he said was, Riker doesn't do things for reasons he can't explain. Whatever he sees in that woman is real. He's not the kind of man who makes mistakes about people. His wife nodded slowly. I just hope the town doesn't make it too hard on her, she said. Cal was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. Me too. Tooltip. Delilah's first full day at the ranch started at 5 in the morning. She was awake before the light, which was not unusual for her. She'd woken early her whole life, conditioned by years of early shifts at the store. She lay in the unfamiliar bedroom, listening to sounds she didn't know yet. The particular creak of this house, the distant low sound of cattle, wind off the ridge that hit the northwest corner of the building at a slightly different angle than wind hit anything in town. She got up. She found the kitchen. It was a good kitchen, bigger than she'd had, with a proper stove and a pump at the sink and enough shelving to be useful. It was also, currently, a disaster. Not filthy. Someone had been cleaning, but disordered in the way of a space that had been maintained by people who didn't cook in it. Things were in wrong places. The salt was next to the lamp oil, which troubled her. There were 3 identical cast iron pans nested on the wrong hook. She started rearranging. She had coffee on and biscuits in the oven by the time Riker came through the kitchen at 5:30. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the changed organization of things. I moved some things, she said, without turning around. If there's a reason they were where they were, tell me. No reason, he said. He sounded like someone who'd just woken up and hadn't yet reassembled his face into its daytime configuration. Coffee? On the stove. He poured it. He sat at the table. She put a plate of biscuits in front of him, and he ate 2 before saying anything. You don't have to cook, he said. There's a hand named Jessup who does it. What does Jessup cook? Beans, mostly. Sometimes the beans have bacon in them. I'll cook, Delilah said. All right. She watched him eat. He was quiet in the morning in a way that she found unexpectedly comfortable. She had spent 6 years making small talk with customers, and it had worn on her in a way she hadn't fully recognized until now, sitting in a kitchen with someone who wasn't performing anything. What do you need from me today? She asked. He looked up. You don't have to. I'm asking what I can do, she said. I'm not decoration. Tell me what needs doing. He looked at her for a moment with that steady look of his. Then he said, Cal's taking 2 men out to the east pasture. I've got a meeting with a buyer at noon. The feed inventory needs counting and reconciling against what Jessup says we have, and I've been putting it off because I hate counting sacks. I'll count sacks, she said. You'll spend the whole morning smelling like grain. I've smelled like things before. A corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went back to his coffee. She counted sacks all morning. The inventory was a mess, not dishonest, just poorly tracked. There were 3 different record books, each started by a different hand at a different time, none of them fully reconciled to the others. She sat on a grain sack in the storage barn and went through all 3 books, and then went through the physical inventory, and by noon she had a single clear account of what was on hand, what was low, and what needed ordering, written in the small, neat hand she'd developed from 6 years of keeping Walt Briggs's books. She brought it to Riker when he got back from his buyer meeting. He looked it over. She watched his face as he read. This is... He stopped. When did you do this? This morning. This would have taken me 2 days. I've been doing bookkeeping since I was 22, she said. It goes faster when you know what you're doing. He looked at the pages again. I didn't know about the shortfall in the oat inventory. Jessup's been telling me we were fine. Jessup may not have been lying, she said carefully. He may just not have checked against all 3 books. They don't agree with each other. I know. He set the papers down. His jaw was doing something, working through something. Cal told me a year ago I needed to get the records organized, and I kept saying I'd get to it. Well, Delilah said, now it's organized. He looked at her. That look again, direct, unhurried, doing something she couldn't quite name. Thank you, he said. She nodded. She went back to the kitchen to start on the midday meal because the men would be coming in from the east pasture hungry, and beans with bacon was not going to cut it. That was the first day. She did not sleep well that first week. The ranch was strange to her body in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Not bad, just different, and different took time. Some nights she lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about what she'd left, which was not much, and what she'd taken on, which was considerably more than she'd first understood. The scale of the operation surprised her. She'd known Riker had a big outfit. Everyone in town knew that. But knowing it abstractly and living inside it were different things. There were 12 men, and the men had particular rhythms and moods and tensions between them that she was learning slowly. There were patterns of work that had been established over years and that she was learning to read. There was the land itself, which was larger than anything she'd ever had jurisdiction over, and which presented problems at a scale she was not yet accustomed to. She was careful in those first days. She asked questions. She watched. She did not make changes she wasn't sure about, and the ones she was sure about, the kitchen, the record books, she made plainly and without apology, because uncertainty would not be an asset here. The hands were wary of her. She'd expected that. Men who had been operating under a particular order of things do not necessarily welcome a change to that order, and she was a change. She heard some of what they said. Not all of it, but enough. The word fat featured. So did skepticism about why Riker had chosen her, which meant skepticism about whether she deserved to be here, which was a form of skepticism she recognized because she had been navigating it her entire adult life. She worked. She kept her head down where it mattered and kept it up where it mattered more. She figured out which of the hands could be relied upon and which needed supervision and which were decent people who were just waiting to see who she was before deciding what they thought. Caldever was the one she figured out first. He was a compact man, somewhere north of 50, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent neutrality that could have been unfriendliness, but turned out, she discovered, to be simple reserve. He watched her the first week with the same quality of attention she gave things, measuring, not judging yet. On the 5th day, she saw him struggling with a supply order that didn't add up, and said quietly, "You've got a math error in the 3rd column." And he looked at her, and then at the paper, and then at her again, and said, "Where?" She showed him. He nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man correcting a mistake without losing face. The next morning he said, "You want to see the east pasture? I'm going out with 2 men to check the fence." She said yes. It was a small thing. It meant something anyway. The town did not adjust quickly. She went in with Riker 2 weeks after the wedding to pick up the linseed oil she'd ordered before she left, and the experience of walking down the main street as Riker Boone's wife was strange. Not entirely bad, but strange. People who had spoken to her every day for 6 years now spoke to her differently. Some were warmer, which felt like pity dressed up as friendliness. Some were cooler, which was more honest but not more comfortable. And a few, Cora Aldridge being the most pointed example, simply looked through her, which was a social maneuver Delilah had practiced with but didn't enjoy any better for the familiarity. She went into the general store. Walt Briggs was behind the counter. "Delilah," he said. Something in his face shifted. She'd known him 6 years and she could read the shifts. This one was complicated. Genuine fondness for her, uncertainty about what she'd become in relation to him, and underneath both of those a faint embarrassment that she'd spent 6 years working for a man who had been paying her less than she was worth, and they both knew it. "Walt," she said, "I'm here for the linseed oil." "Right." He got it from the back. He set it on the counter. "How is it? Out there? The ranch?" "It's a lot of work," she said honestly. "Riker treating you right?" She looked at him. "Yes, Walt. He is." He nodded. He tallied up the oil. He was, she noticed, giving her a courtesy price, slightly lower than what she knew the wholesale cost to be, and she considered whether to mention it and decided not to. It was his version of an apology. She could accept that. Out on the boardwalk, Riker was talking to a man she recognized as one of the larger ranch owners in the valley, a man named Porter Gillespie, who had an opinion about everything and the land holdings to make people listen to it. Riker's expression was polite but closed. "Just saying it surprised people," Porter was saying when she got close enough to hear. "Nobody expected—" He saw her. "Mrs. Boone," he said. His tone was careful in a way that made her aware of everything it was covering. "Mr. Gillespie," she said, "we were just—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. There was no way to finish it that didn't reveal exactly what they'd been discussing. Riker looked at him for a moment with that particular quality of his that wasn't quite coldness. It was more like a door closing. "Porter," he said, "good talking to you." He took the oil from Delilah and put it in the wagon bed and helped her up to the seat without commentary. They drove out of town in silence for a few minutes. Then Riker said, "He was going to tell me I should have thought harder before making a choice that was going to cost me socially." "Were you?" "No." She looked out at the valley rolling past, the dried grass, the rock ridge dark against the afternoon sky. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't want you to damage yourself on my account." "You're not damaging me," he said, "and I didn't marry you to make the town comfortable." A beat. "I married you because you're the person I want to be doing this with. If they can't sort themselves out about it, that's their problem to carry." She was quiet for a moment. Out to the east, she could see the top of the canyon ridge where, though she didn't know it yet, everything that mattered would eventually be decided. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he agreed, and they drove home in the low November light, and the valley held all its trouble and its beauty, at once the way valleys do, indifferent to human arrangements, waiting to see what people would do with what they'd been given. She wasn't sure yet what she'd do with it, but she was here. She was present, and she had never in her life given up on something that mattered because someone else decided it was too hard. She wasn't about to start now. The first real trouble came not from a person, but from a silence. 3 days into December, Riker rode into town to finalize a hay contract with a supplier named Aldous Fenn, a man he'd been doing business with for 6 years, always on a handshake and a written figure, never a problem. Fenn ran the only feed operation in Black Hollow big enough to supply a ranch Riker's size through a hard winter, and the contract was supposed to be a formality, the kind of meeting that took 20 minutes and ended with coffee. Riker came home 2 hours later without a contract. Delilah was in the kitchen when she heard him come in. She could tell from the sound of the door, not slammed, but closed with a firmness that meant something had gone wrong, and she came to the doorway and looked at him. He set his hat on the peg. He stood there a moment with his back to her. "Fenn won't sell to us," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Did he say why? He said his inventory was committed for the season. Riker turned around. His face was controlled, but around his eyes there was something tight. "He's got enough hay to supply 3 ranches our size. I know it because I was there in September when his last shipment came in." "Who told him not to?" Delilah said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know yet." He sat down at the table. "I've got feelers out." She got the coffee pot. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him and sat down across from him, and they were quiet together the way they'd gotten into the habit of being quiet. Not awkwardly, but in the way of people who have figured out that not everything needs to be said immediately. "We can get hay from Tanner," she said after a while. "He was talking last week about having more than he needs. A Tanner's hay is poor quality for winter feed. It's better than nothing." "Yes," he said. "It is." He drank his coffee. "I'll ride out to Tanner tomorrow." She nodded. She was already thinking about the feed numbers, the head count, how much of a shortfall they were looking at if they had to rely on Tanner through February. The math was uncomfortable, but not impossible. She would do it tonight after supper and know what they were actually dealing with. What she didn't say, and what she thought about while she made supper, was that Aldous Fenn refusing them was not an isolated thing. It was a signal. Someone in Black Hollow had decided that the way to deal with Riker Boone's inexplicable choice of wife was to make the choice costly, and they'd started where it would hurt fastest, the supply lines that kept a ranch alive through winter. She understood the logic. She didn't like it, but she understood it. By the second week of December, 2 of Riker's hands had quit. The first was a man named Dob Carver, who gave no reason except that he'd found work elsewhere. Delilah had watched Dob Carver for 3 weeks and had formed a clear opinion of him. He was a decent worker who cared very much about what other men thought of him, which meant he was exactly the kind of man who could be pressured into leaving without anyone having to say anything directly. Someone had said something directly anyway, she suspected, because he left 2 days after riding into town on his afternoon off. The second was worse. His name was Frank Osley, and he was one of Cal's most experienced fence riders, a man who knew the East Pasture terrain better than anyone else on the property. He quit on a Tuesday morning, and when Cal tried to talk to him about it, Frank said, "I just don't think this outfit's going to be what it was," and walked to the bunkhouse to pack his things. Cal came to Delilah, not to Riker, which she registered and filed away. "Frank's leaving," he said. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. "I couldn't change his mind." "I know," she said. "I heard. Someone's been talking to the men. In town, I think. I don't know who." She looked at him. "Do you have a guess?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Porter Gillespie's got a nephew who drinks at the same saloon as half our crew," he said. "That's not evidence. That's just a pattern." "It's enough to think about," she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. At the door he stopped and said without turning around, "The men that are left, the ones worth keeping. They're watching to see how you handle this." "I know that too," she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the wall, and then she went and got the account books because there was nothing to be done about Frank Osley, and she could still do something about the numbers. The rumors started reaching her in fragments, the way rumors in small towns always do. Through the mouth of someone who isn't the source, carrying the particular shape of something that has been passed through several pairs of hands before arriving. The most persistent one was that she had manipulated Riker. The theory, as near as she could reconstruct it, was that she had used her position at the general store to cultivate his trust over years, that she had managed somehow to make herself seem more capable than she was, and that Riker, being a man who worked hard and perhaps didn't have much experience with women, had been deceived. The implication was that the marriage was not a real choice, but a scheme, and that the scheme was aimed at his land. She heard this version from 3 separate people within 2 weeks, which meant it had become the official story in at least one of the town's social circles. She heard it first from Meredith Hale, who told her with the slightly pained expression of someone delivering news they find distasteful but feel obligated to report. She heard it second from Cal's wife, Margaret, who said it with anger on Delilah's behalf. She heard it a third time from a ranch hand's wife at the dry goods counter in town, who didn't know Delilah was standing 3 feet away when she said it to the woman beside her. That third time was the one that actually cost her something. She stood very still and listened to the woman finish her sentence, and then she picked up her order and walked out of the store and stood in the cold outside and breathed until her hand stopped wanting to shake. Then she went back in and got the one item she'd forgotten, because she needed it and she was not going to let a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear drive her out of the only general store in 20 miles. Riker asked her about it that evening. She didn't know how he'd found out. Maybe Cal, maybe someone else. But he came in from the barn with his jaw set in a way she'd learned meant he was holding something in check. "I heard what happened at the store," he said. "It's fine," she said. "It's not fine." "Riker." She turned from the stove to look at him directly. "I've been hearing what people say about me since I was a child. I know how to walk out of a room. What I can't afford is to waste energy on it." She turned back. "The hay situation is what needs solving." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference." Another silence. Then he said, "I found a hay supplier in Merton County. It'll cost more the hauling distance." "How much more?" He told her. She thought about the numbers. "We can absorb it through January," she said. "February will be tight if we have a bad month." February's always a bad month. "Then we'll need to find another source by then, or sell some of the younger stock now before prices drop further." "I was thinking the same thing." He sat down. "I didn't think it would go this fast." "What? The pressure?" "Yes." She brought him coffee. She sat across from him. Outside, the wind was doing the thing it did in December, coming off the ridge with a low, persistent sound that never entirely stopped. "Someone is organizing this," she said. "It's not just social disapproval. The supply refusals, the hands leaving, that's coordinated. Someone is spending effort on this." "Porter Gillespie has wanted to buy my east pasture for 4 years," Riker said. "I've turned him down twice." "You think this is about the land?" "I think the marriage gave him a reason to do something he already wanted to do." He looked at her. "I think he figured if he could make things difficult enough, I'd either come to my senses," his phrase, not mine, "or I'd have enough financial pressure that I'd need to sell." She looked at him steadily. "And? And I'm not selling anything." "Then we need to shore up the supply chain ourselves and stop depending on people in this town to deal with us fairly," she said. "We do the hay run from Merton County. We talk to the smaller farms east of the ridge about direct arrangements. We find out which suppliers aren't connected to Gillespie and build relationships there." He was quiet, listening. "And we stop waiting for the town to come around," she said. "We build what we need to survive without them, and we let them watch us do it." He looked at her across the table in the December kitchen with the wind outside, and there was something in his face she'd seen before. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, like someone finding a thing where they expected it to be. "All right," he said. They started the next morning. January was brutal by any measure. The temperature dropped in the second week and did not come back up. 2 of the water troughs froze solid overnight, and they lost a calf to cold that they might have saved if they'd had more hands. The 2 men who'd quit in December hadn't been replaced, and what was left was stretched thin across the work the ranch demanded in hard weather. Delilah learned things about her own body that winter that she hadn't known before. She learned that she could work for 12 hours in cold that made her face hurt, and then do 2 more hours of bookkeeping by lamplight and still wake up before 5. She learned that the particular exhaustion of outdoor ranch work in winter was different from any tiredness she'd felt before, heavier, more complete, the kind that gets into your bones. She learned that she could carry more than she'd thought, move faster, think clearer under pressure. She also learned which of the remaining hands had made a quiet decision to stay, not just because they needed the wage, but because they'd decided she was worth staying for. There were 4 of them, by her count. One was a young man named Birch, 19, still soft around the edges, who had started finding reasons to work near wherever she was, and who one day, without prompting, stepped in to help her drag a feed sack that had torn and was going to spill if she kept wrestling it alone. He didn't say anything. He just grabbed the other end, and they moved it together. She thanked him. He shrugged and went back to work. But after that, he always seemed to know when something needed 2 people. Cal Deaver, she had already sorted. Margaret Deaver, his wife, came out to the ranch in mid-January with a pot of preserved plums and an expression that said she had made a decision about Delilah, and the decision was favorable. They drank tea in the kitchen while Cal and Riker looked at fence maps in the other room, and Margaret said without preamble, "I want you to know I think what they're doing is wrong. The Gillespie crowd. I wanted you to hear it straight." "Thank you," Delilah said. "Cal said you figured it out before anyone else did." "It wasn't hard to figure out." "It wasn't hard, but most people wouldn't have said it out loud." Margaret looked at her steadily. "A lot of women in your position would have gone quiet and hoped it stopped." "Going quiet doesn't usually make it stop," Delilah said. "No," Margaret said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind was going again. "You know what Cora Aldridge said at the quilting circle last week?" Margaret said. "I can imagine." "She said that a man who'd make a choice like Riker made clearly has poor judgment, and you can't trust a rancher with poor judgment to manage his land responsibly." Margaret's mouth tightened. "Which is, when you look at it honestly, her saying that he should have chosen her, and since he didn't, he must be broken." Delilah was quiet for a moment. "She wanted him badly," she said. "That's real. I'm not going to make fun of that." Margaret looked at her with something approaching surprise. "Most women would be less charitable." "Most women haven't spent 30 years being told they don't deserve what they want," Delilah said. "I know what it feels like to be told no by the world. I'm not in the business of adding to that for somebody else." She paused. "I just wish she'd find a different way to deal with it than making our lives harder." The supplier arrangement from Merton County worked, but barely. The hauling cost ate into the margin Riker had been counting on for spring herd expansion, and by mid-January they were making careful decisions about every expenditure in a way that ranches weren't supposed to have to do in the middle of winter, when the work itself was already demanding everything. Delilah had identified 3 farms east of the ridge that were willing to deal with them directly, 2 for grain, 1 for hay, and the negotiations had gone better than she'd expected. The farmers there were not connected to Gillespie's network, either because they were too far out or because they were the kind of people who made their own judgments about who they'd do business with. One of them, an older farmer named Horace Webb, shook her hand after they agreed on terms and said, "I heard some things about your situation in town. Doesn't sound like my business." He paused. "You seem straight to me. We'll see how it goes." "That's all I'd ask," she said. It was not warm, exactly, but it was honest, and honest she could work with. The ones she couldn't work with were closer to home. A rancher named Burl Hackett, whose land abutted Riker's on the south side, had been a functional neighbor for years, not close, but reliable in the way of men who share a fence line and therefore have practical reasons to stay cordial. In January, he let that cordiality go. The fence line between their properties developed a gap that, on close inspection, had been cut rather than broken. 3 of Riker's cattle got through before Birch found it. Riker rode over to Hackett's place. He came back with his jaw set and did not say much about the conversation, except that Hackett had denied knowing anything about the cut fence and had not offered to help repair it. "He's been talking to Gillespie," Cal said. "Probably," Riker agreed. Delilah said, "We repair the fence and we document it." Both men looked at her. "Write down the date, describe the cut, note that it was deliberate. If this continues, we'll want a record." "You think it'll come to something legal?" Riker asked. "I don't know, but records are easier to keep than to reconstruct." He nodded. They repaired the fence. She wrote it down in a separate book she'd started keeping. Dates, incidents, names, particulars. She wasn't sure yet what it would amount to. She knew it was better to have it than not. That was January. Cold and tight and full of small battles that didn't announce themselves as battles until you were already in the middle of them. But she was still here. Riker was still here. And somewhere east of the ridge, past the farms that had agreed to deal with them, and the canyon land that no one had paid much attention to in years, the valley was holding a drought in its future, like a secret it hadn't told anyone yet. The sky was clear and cold and gave nothing away. The land looked hard and simple the way land always looks in winter, and underneath it the water table was doing things that no one in Black Hollow was watching closely enough to notice. Not yet. The drought announced itself the way bad things usually do. Not all at once, but incrementally, in small signs that were easy to dismiss until they weren't. March came in dry. That happened sometimes. April stayed dry, which was less common but not unheard of. By the middle of May, the creek that ran along the south edge of Riker's property had dropped to half its usual level, and the grass in the east pasture was coming up thin and pale in a way that Cal Devers said he hadn't seen since the bad year 9 years back, the one that had pushed 2 smaller outfits into bankruptcy and forced a third to sell to Porter Gillespie at a price that everyone agreed was less than it was worth. Delilah noticed the water table first because she was the one keeping the household accounts and the ranch supply records, and the numbers told a story before the land made it obvious. They were using more water to get the same results. The well was taking longer to recover between draws. She wrote it down in her incident book, not as a crisis, but as a pattern, and she started watching the sky with a different quality of attention. By June, nobody was dismissing it anymore. The creek dropped to a trickle. The east pasture grass turned yellow and didn't come back. 3 of the smaller ranches in the valley had already started talking about moving their herds east toward the Merton County water sources, which was expensive and hard on cattle, and only slightly better than the alternative. Horace Webb, the farmer east of the ridge who'd shaken Delilah's hand and called her straight, rode over in the 3rd week of June to tell her he was thinking about it. "I've got maybe 6 weeks of water left in my well at current usage," he said. He was standing in the yard, turning his hat in his hands, a man in his 60s who had survived hard seasons before and knew the difference between hard and impossible. "After that, I don't know." "Sit down," Delilah said. "Let me get you something cold." He sat on the porch step. She brought water. They still had enough, though she was being careful. And he drank it and looked out at the valley with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the results. "What are the other farms doing?" she asked. "Otis Brand's already moving his herd. Lena Cord's selling off her older stock at terrible prices because she doesn't have the water to feed them through summer." He shook his head. "Porter Gillespie's been making offers, not good ones." She was quiet. "He offered me 60 cents on the dollar for my east field last week," Webb said. "Told me he was doing me a favor. Are you going to take it?" "I don't want to." He looked at her. "But 60 cents on the dollar is better than nothing, which is what I'll have if the water runs out and I can't keep the farm going." She thought about what she'd been thinking about for 3 weeks, since the pattern in the numbers had become clear. She'd been turning it over carefully, testing it from different angles, trying to find the place where it fell apart. It kept not falling apart, which was either because it was actually a workable idea or because she was too close to it to see the flaw clearly. She said, "What do you know about the canyon reservoir? The old one, up in the North Canyon, off the ridge." Webb looked at her. "I know it's been dry for 20 years. "Has it?" He frowned. "That's what people say." "People say it's dry because the intake channel silted up," she said. "Not because the water source failed. The source is snowmelt from the upper ridge. The channel just stopped carrying it." She paused. "I've been looking at the survey maps, the ones from the original land grants." "Where'd you get those?" "County Records Office. I rode to the county seat 3 weeks ago." She looked at him steadily. "The reservoir basin is intact. The intake channel is about 40 yards of silt and debris. If someone cleared it, the reservoir would fill." Webb stared at her for a long moment. "That's a lot of work." "Yes. You'd need, I don't know, a week of labor with a good crew, maybe more." "Probably more," she said honestly. But the reservoir, if it fills, has distribution channels to 6 different properties in this valley. They're overgrown, but they're there. They were built 70 years ago, and stone doesn't rot. He looked away at the valley again. She could see him thinking. The careful, reluctant thinking of a man who wants to believe something and is trying to find a reason not to, because belief is expensive when you've been disappointed before. "Who else have you told about this?" he asked. "Nobody yet. I'm telling you first." "Why?" "Because you're the most practical person I know in this valley who isn't connected to Gillespie," she said, "and because I need someone to tell me if I'm wrong before I try to convince anyone else." He was quiet for a good 30 seconds. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and regarded them both with the particular arrogance of crows. "You're not wrong about the channel," he said finally. "I remember my father talking about that reservoir when I was a boy. He said it was the best water source in the valley before it silted up. Said it was a waste that nobody fixed it." He turned his hat over in his hands. "The question is whether you can get enough people to work on it together without it falling apart over old arguments." "Yes," Delilah said. "That's the question." Sut, she told Riker that night. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. He didn't anticipate the end of a thought and jump to it. He let things arrive in their own order. She laid it out the way she'd been laying it out in her own head. The reservoir, the intake channel, the distribution system, the survey maps, the math on how much water it could move if it was working properly. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 6 properties, he said. "Yes, including ours and 3 of the farms east of the ridge." "And the other 2? "Hackett's South Pasture, and 1 parcel that currently belongs to a man named Trevelyan, who bought it from the county 2 years ago. He's been trying to run sheep, not cattle. He's also barely spoken to anyone since he arrived, so I don't know his situation." Riker nodded slowly. "Hackett's not going to want to work with us." "No," she agreed. "But he might want the water anyway." People don't always choose the thing that helps them when it means working alongside someone they've decided to dislike. "I know," she said. "We have to try regardless." She paused. "Gillespie doesn't have land on any of those 6 parcels. His water comes from the river on the west side of the valley. If this reservoir system works, it strengthens the smaller properties and the farms against him. He won't want it to succeed." Riker looked at her. "You think he'll try to stop it?" "I think he'll try to make sure it doesn't happen, whether that's by discrediting the idea before it gets started or something more direct. I don't know." She met his eyes. "I think we have to move fast and be careful." He got up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the dark, which was what he did sometimes when he was thinking hard, moved his body while his mind worked. "The county records," he said. "The survey maps. Are the distribution channels on those maps legally part of the original land grants?" "Yes. Common water rights established in the original grant language. No single owner can block them." He turned around. "So Gillespie can't legally prevent the other property owners from using them?" "Not legally," she said. "No." The way she said it told him what she wasn't saying, which was that legal and actual were sometimes 2 different countries with a long road between them. "All right," he said. "Who do we talk to first?" "Webb has already agreed to think about it. I want to talk to Trevelyan before anyone else. He's an unknown. And then we need to call a meeting of all the affected property owners." She paused. "Including Hackett. Hackett's going to say no. Probably. But I'd rather have him say no in a room full of people who are saying yes than have him say no in private and then work against us afterward." Riker looked at her for a moment. "When did you get so tactical?" "I've been tactical my whole life," she said. "I just didn't used to have anything worth being tactical about." The meeting was held on the 2nd Saturday of July at the Webb farm. Because Webb had the biggest barn and the most central location, and because it was his farm rather than the Boone Ranch, which Delilah calculated would make it slightly easier for people who were still uncomfortable about her to show up. 7 people came. Webb, the cord woman, Lena, who arrived alone and sat in the back and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. A man named Doss, who ran the smallest cattle operation in the valley and was visibly frightened. The Trevelyan sheep farmer, who turned out to be younger than Delilah had expected and more interested than she'd hoped. Cal Deaver, there in support, and Burl Hackett, who sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set and did not look at Delilah directly once during the entire meeting. Riker introduced the proposal. Delilah had suggested this, and he'd agreed without making her feel managed, which she'd appreciated. She knew the room would listen to him first, and listening first was all she needed. He explained the reservoir. He explained the intake channel and the silt problem. He explained the distribution system and the survey maps and the legal standing of the common water rights. Then he said, "My wife has been working on this for 6 weeks. She knows the maps better than I do. Delilah?" She stood up. She had prepared for this in the way she prepared for everything, so thoroughly, without pretending it was going to be easy. She put the survey maps on the table where people could see them. She walked through the numbers, the estimated volume of the reservoir at capacity, the distribution flow rates, how long it would take to fill from the ridge snowmelt, how much labor the channel clearing would require. Doss interrupted her halfway through. "Even if all that's right," he said, "who's going to do the work? My men are already running thin." "We pool the labor," Delilah said. "Same principle as the water rights. Proportional contribution from each property based on how much of the water system serves them. And if someone contributes less than they should, then they get less water than they otherwise would. It's written into the original grant language. Contribution and benefit are linked." Lena Cord spoke from the back for the first time. "How do we know this will actually work? That the channel can be cleared?" "We don't know for certain," Delilah said. "I've been to the canyon twice. The channel blockage is dense, but it's manageable. It's silt and debris, not rock. A crew of 8 men with the right tools could clear the primary blockage in 4 or 5 days. Maybe 6. She paused. "That's my honest estimate, not an optimistic one. And if we clear it and the reservoir doesn't fill, then we've lost a week of labor, which is bad. But we've lost it on something that had a real chance, which is different from doing nothing and waiting to see who Gillespie buys out first." Silence in the barn. Hot July silence, full of flies and the distant sound of cattle. Hackett spoke for the first time. "I don't see why I should work alongside people." He stopped, and the stop was pointed. "Whose judgment I don't trust." "Mr. Hackett," Delilah said, and she kept her voice even because uneven was what he wanted. "Your south pasture is one of the 6 parcels in this distribution system. You're going to lose that pasture to drought by August if you don't have a water source. The question you have to answer isn't whether you like the people proposing the solution. It's whether you want to keep your land." His jaw tightened. "You don't have to like me," she said. "You have to decide if the water's worth more than the opinion." The barn was very quiet. Trevelyan, the sheep farmer, said, "I'm in." He said it simply, like a man who has heard enough to make up his mind and doesn't need more time. "What do you need from me?" 2 men in a week starting Monday, Delilah said. "Done," Webb said. "Same for me." Lena Cord said, "I can give you 1 man, maybe 2 by Wednesday." Doss took a long breath. "All right, 1 man." Everyone looked at Hackett. He sat with his arms still crossed for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll think about it," and stood up and left without another word. It was not a yes. It was also not a no that could be used against them publicly, which was perhaps all she was going to get from Burl Hackett, and she'd take it. They started Monday. The canyon was harder than the maps suggested, which was not a surprise but was still a problem. The silt was deeper in some sections, and the debris was tangled with root systems from 20 years of scrub growth that had pushed down into the channel walls. It was slow, filthy work, the kind that produced visible results only if you zoomed far out and looked at the whole week rather than any given hour. Delilah worked the canyon with the crews. Riker had told her she didn't need to. "You've done the planning. You can manage from the ranch." And she had told him, pleasantly and without room for argument, that she was going. She wasn't built for digging in the way that Birch was, or the way the Trevelyan man's 2 workers were, both young, strong, with the particular loose-jointed efficiency of people who do hard physical work for a living. She was slower. She ached in places she hadn't known had their own nerve endings. But she worked, and she kept working, and the crew watched her do it, and drew their own conclusions. On Wednesday evening, Riker came to the canyon with food from Margaret Deaver, who had been cooking in bulk without being asked, and with news. "Gillespie knows," he said. Delilah was sitting on a rock at the canyon mouth, washing silt off her hands with a very small amount of water. She looked up. How'd he find out? I don't know. Could have been Hackett. Could have been anyone. What's he doing about it? He's been telling people in town that it's a waste of time, that the reservoir is damaged beyond repair, which is a lie, and that we don't have the water rights we think we do, which is also a lie. Riker crouched down beside her. He's also been talking to the county commissioner. About what? I don't know yet. Cal's trying to find out. She dried her hands on her pants. Her back hurt. Her shoulders hurt. She was tired in a way that went all the way down. He's going to move before we finish, she said. He's not going to wait and see if it works. No, Riker agreed. He's not. She looked at the canyon. In the low evening light, it was almost beautiful. The red walls, the shadow pooling in the channel where the crew had worked today, the slow revelation of the old stonework under all those years of growth. Someone had built this in the first place, some long-ago person who'd looked at this canyon and decided it could be made useful, could hold something, could give it back. She felt connected to that person in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone. We go faster, she said. We push harder tomorrow and the day after. We need the primary blockage cleared before he can do anything official. The crew's already tired. I know, so am I. She stood up stiffly. Tell them what's coming. Tell them the truth about Gillespie and what he's trying to do. People work harder when they know the reason. Riker looked at her. You sure? No, she said. I'm doing it anyway. She went back into the canyon to help the last two men with the final hour of daylight. She didn't know yet what Gillespie had planned. She didn't know that by Friday, while the crew worked in the canyon, two men she didn't recognize would be seen near the upper ridge where the intake channel fed down from the snowmelt source. She didn't know what they did up there, or what it would mean when the storm came. But Friday was still 2 days away, and there was still work to do, and the light lasted a little longer every time she thought it was gone. She picked up her shovel. The storm came Thursday night, which was 1 day earlier than anyone had expected and considerably worse. Delilah woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the wind doing something she hadn't heard it do before. Not the persistent low note off the ridge that she'd gotten used to, but something higher and more erratic, the kind of wind that changes direction while you're listening to it. She lay still for a moment and heard rain behind the wind, which should have been good news. Rain was what the valley needed, but the sound of it was wrong. Too hard. Too sudden after months of nothing. She got up. Riker was already awake, standing at the kitchen window with the lamp turned low. How bad? She asked. I don't know yet. He was watching the yard where the rain was coming sideways and the lamplight caught it in sheets. Cal rode out at midnight to check the east pasture. He's not back. She stood beside him and looked at the dark. The rain on the roof was loud enough that she had to think through it rather than talk through it, parsing what mattered from what didn't. The canyon. The crew left the tools in the canyon, she said. Yes. If the channel's flooded, I know. She went to get her coat. Delilah. He turned from the window. It's 2 in the morning, and it's a bad storm. You're not going into the canyon in this. The primary blockage is cleared, but the secondary isn't, she said. If water comes down from the ridge before the secondary channel is open, it'll back up and blow out the walls. We'll lose the whole project. We'll lose it or we won't. You going into that canyon tonight isn't going to change the physics of it. She looked at him. If there's a chance it helps, I'm going. He looked back at her for a long moment. Then he got his own coat. I figured, he said. Cal met them on the road, coming back from the east pasture with his horse blowing hard and his face wet. Pasture's holding, he said. Trough's overflowing, but that's fine. What are you two doing out? Canyon, Riker said. Cal processed this. I'll come. You just rode 4 hours. Canyon's more important than the 4 hours. He turned his horse without further discussion. The road to the canyon was a road in the loose sense, a track really, that became increasingly uncertain as the rain came harder. Delilah rode between the two men and focused on not losing the track in the dark. Her horse was unhappy about the situation and made its unhappiness known in the particular stiff-legged way of horses that are going somewhere against their preference but are too well trained to actually refuse. She was cold. Her coat was heavy wool, and it was doing its job, but the rain was relentless, and the canyon approach was exposed. And by the time they reached the canyon mouth, she was wet in the places that mattered and working to ignore it. The canyon itself told her immediately that her concern was correct. The water was already moving in the channel, not the flood she'd feared, not yet, but a preliminary rush, dark and fast and carrying debris from the upper slope. The primary clearance they'd done over 4 days was holding, channeling the water where it was supposed to go, but at the secondary blockage she could see the problem. The water was meeting the remaining obstruction and beginning to pool, and pooling water at that volume against an earthen wall was exactly as dangerous as she'd told Riker it would be. "Secondary's backing up," Cal said, beside her. "Yes." She was already calculating. The secondary blockage was about 30 feet of compacted silt and old root debris that the crew hadn't gotten to yet. They had tools here. Shovels, a pickaxe, a pry bar. The water was maybe 6 inches deep at the blockage point and rising. "How long before it breaches?" Riker asked. "If the rain keeps up like this?" 4 hours, maybe 5. If it gets heavier... "Less," Cal said. "Less," she agreed. Riker looked at the blockage, then at her. "Tell me what to do." She told him. She'd been looking at this channel for a week, and she knew where the weak points were, not just in the blockage itself, but in the wall structure around it, the places where clearing had to happen in the right order, or the whole thing would collapse inward instead of opening outward. She explained it fast, the way you explain things when time is the constraint, and Riker listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, taking it in. Then he picked up a shovel and went into the water. Cal went in beside him. Delilah took the pry bar and went to the outer edge of the blockage where the root system was and started working on it, because the roots were holding the silt together, and if she could loosen the root structure, the men could move the silt faster. The water was cold. She registered this and then put it away because registering it and dwelling on it were different things. She worked the pry bar into the root mass and leaned into it with everything she had, which was not as much as Riker or Cal, but was not nothing either. And she felt the root system shift slightly, then more, and she moved the bar to a different purchase point and did it again. They worked for 40 minutes without talking much. The rain didn't let up. The water at the blockage point crept from 6 inches to 8, and then the outer edge of the root mass she'd been working on gave way with a tearing sound, and 2 feet of the blockage face slumped outward, and the men got their shovels into the gap and started moving it. It was hard going. Wet silt is heavier than dry silt by a factor that becomes immediately apparent when you're moving it with a shovel in the dark, and the root debris came out in tangled masses that had to be dragged clear before the next section could be reached. Riker was doing most of the heavy movement, and his breathing was audible over the rain. Cal's technique was more efficient. Less force, better angles, and he was moving as much material in less effort, which was the kind of thing you could see in a man who'd done physical labor his whole life and had learned to spend himself carefully. Delilah worked the pry bar ahead of them, opening the next section before they reached it. Her hands hurt. She kept working. At some point past 3 in the morning, she had lost specific track of time, Riker said, "Stop," and she stopped, and they all stood still in the water and listened. The sound was different. The pooling water behind the blockage was moving differently, pulling toward the gap they'd made rather than pressing against the wall. "It's draining," Cal said. "Keep going," Delilah said. "The gap isn't wide enough yet. If the rain picks up again..." "Keep going," Riker agreed, and they did. Well, it was close to 5 in the morning when the secondary channel opened fully. Not dramatically, no great rush of water, no collapse. Just a widening of the flow as the last major section of blockage came clear, and the backed-up water found its way through into the lower channel with a deep, satisfied sound, like something exhaling after a long time holding. The 3 of them stood in the now moving water and looked at it. Cal said, "Well." "Yeah," Riker said. Delilah didn't say anything. She was too tired to say anything. She stood there with the pry bar in her hands and the rain on her face and watched the water move the way it was supposed to move, through the channel they'd spent a week making available to it, and she felt, not triumph exactly, not yet, something quieter, a particular exhaustion that comes after doing a hard thing and having it work, when your body finally allows itself to acknowledge how much it cost. "We need to get up to the upper intake," she said when she could. "The men I didn't recognize. The ones on the ridge Friday. I need to see what they were doing up there." Cal and Riker both looked at her. "What men?" Cal asked. "Birch saw 2 men on the upper ridge Friday afternoon," she said, "near the intake feed from the snowmelt. He told me Friday night. I didn't know what to do about it with the storm coming, and then the storm came and—" "You should have told me," Riker said. "I know. I'm telling you now." His jaw tightened. Not at her, she thought. At the situation, at the existence of something he hadn't known to watch for. "What do you think they did?" "I think they tried to block the intake," she said, "or damage it. Something to prevent the water from reaching the channel even if we got the blockage cleared." Cal was already calculating. If the intake's blocked, then all of this— He gestured at the moving water. "All of this buys us a few hours while the existing flow drains out of the upper section," she said. "After that, nothing reaches the reservoir." The rain was lightening slightly. The sky to the east had that particular quality of very early morning, dark, but with some distinction between the sky and the ridgeline. "How far to the upper intake?" Riker asked. "An hour on horseback if the trail's passable, more if it's not." "Then we go now, before it's full light and before anyone knows we're looking." They went. But the upper trail was passable, barely. The rain had loosened the surface and the horses picked their way up with the grudging care of animals that knew exactly how uncertain the footing was and were not going to pretend otherwise. Delilah's horse slipped once on a switchback and caught itself, and her stomach did something unpleasant before both of them recovered. The intake point was where the survey maps had shown it, a stone-lined channel cut into the base of the rock face where the snowmelt gathered and began its descent. Old work, solid work, the kind of construction that had been built to last and had. And there, across the intake mouth, was what she'd feared. Not a natural blockage, a constructed one, timber beams, 3 of them, wedged into the channel walls with iron pins driven into the stone. Not something you'd do in an afternoon, something you'd plan, bring materials for, execute with specific knowledge of the intake structure. Whoever had done this knew what the intake looked like before they came up here, which meant they'd seen the survey maps, which meant either they had access to the county records or someone who had talked to Delilah had talked to them. She stood looking at the timber blockage with the water pressing against it from above, backed up in a small dark pool, not going anywhere. Riker crouched down and looked at the iron pins. "These are set deep," he said. "They brought a hammer and a punch to do this." "Or they had help from someone with equipment," Cal said. Riker looked at the pins again. "These are the same iron fittings Porter Gillespie uses for his fence posts," he said quietly. "I've seen them 100 times. He buys them from a smithy in Merton County. Same stamp on the head." "That's not proof," Delilah said. "No," Riker agreed, "it's not. But I want to keep one." She looked at him. "Pull one of the pins and keep it, and I want to look for anything else they might have left." What they found, wedged into a crack in the rock wall above the intake, was a folded piece of oilskin that had been caught by the storm and hadn't blown free. Inside the oilskin was a note, not a personal note, just a set of measurements and instructions in plain handwriting, the kind of working note a man makes for himself when he's doing something he needs to get right. The measurements matched the intake channel dimensions precisely. "Someone sent them with specifications," Cal said. "Someone who had access to engineering drawings," Delilah said, "or who'd been to the intake before and took measurements." "Gillespie's been in this valley 40 years, Riker said. She held the note carefully by its edge, already thinking about the incident book at home, about county records, about the stamp on the iron pins and what a smithy in Merton County might be willing to say about who ordered them. They pulled the timber beams out. It took all 3 of them, working the iron pins loose with the pry bar she'd carried up from the canyon and brute persistence. 2 of the pins came out clean. The 3rd broke at the head, which meant they had 2 intact pins with the stamp and 1 stub in the stone that would remain as evidence of the whole. She noted all of it: date, time, location, what they found, what they removed, what remained. When the intake was clear, the water did what water does when you stop preventing it. It moved. It ran down into the channel and toward the reservoir with a quiet, indifferent purpose. And standing at the intake watching it go, Delilah felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something more like the particular relief of having been right about something that mattered when being wrong would have been very bad. They got back to the ranch at 7 in the morning. Margaret Deaver was in the kitchen, which meant Cal had told her about the canyon, which meant she'd come because she was the kind of woman who showed up when things were hard. She had coffee on and food made, and she looked at the three of them, soaked, covered in silt, running on no sleep, with the calm assessment of someone who has spent a long time married to a man who periodically comes home looking like this. "Sit down," she said. They sat. Birch was there too, at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup, looking guilty in the particular way of young men who have told someone something important and are now wondering if they told them in time. "You found it?" he asked Delilah. "We found it," she said. "You told me at the right time. You didn't do anything wrong." Some of the tension went out of his shoulders. She drank coffee and ate what Margaret put in front of her and thought about what came next. The reservoir would start filling now. It would take days, maybe a week and a half at the current flow rate, to reach the distribution threshold, the level at which it could supply the channel network consistently. In the meantime, the rain had given the valley some relief, enough to buy time, but the sabotage was a different matter. The pins, the note, the measurements. Alone, each piece was circumstantial. Together, they told a story that a careful person could follow. She needed the smithy. She needed to know if there were records of who ordered those specific fittings. She needed the county commissioner's office to know that Gillespie had been there asking questions about the water rights, and she needed that on record before Gillespie had the chance to revise the story. "Riker," she said. He looked at her across the table. He was exhausted. She could see it clearly in the way his face had stopped managing itself, the way it did when he was too tired to keep the presentation going. She thought she probably looked the same. "We need to go to the county seat," she said. "Not tomorrow. Today. Today. Before Gillespie does. I want to file a formal complaint about the intake sabotage, and I want it in the record before anyone else can characterize what happened up there." He looked at her for a moment. His coffee cup was in his hands, and he looked at it and then back at her. "You need to sleep first," he said. 2 hours, she said. "Then we go." He thought about arguing. She could see him think about it. Then he said, 2 hours, and finished his coffee. Cal said he'd stay at the ranch and watch the canyon approach and make sure nothing else happened while they were gone. Margaret said she'd stay with Cal. Birch said he'd ride a perimeter of the upper trail every few hours. It was not an elegant plan. It was what they had. She went and lay down for 2 hours, which became 2.5 because her body simply refused to cooperate with the plan on schedule, and then she got up and changed into dry clothes and went out to find Riker already waiting with the horses. He looked her over once. "Ready?" "No," she said, putting her foot in the stirrup. "Let's go." They rode toward the county seat in the early morning, the valley wet and still around them, the reservoir somewhere behind them beginning its slow, patient filling, water moving through old stone channels that had waited 20 years for someone to clear the way. The county seat was a full day's ride, and they made it in 7 hours because neither of them was in the mood to be careful about pace. The clerk at the county records office was a thin man named Aldrich, who wore his glasses on the end of his nose and had the particular quality of bureaucrats who take their function seriously. Not the power of it, but the record itself, the preservation of fact. Delilah had dealt with him on her first visit when she'd come for the survey maps, and she'd liked him for the same reason she liked well-kept ledgers. He didn't editorialize. He just kept track. She laid everything on his desk, the iron pins, the oilskin note, the stub photograph Riker had sketched of the remaining pinhole in the stone, her incident book, open to the relevant entries going back to January, the cut fence, the supply refusals, the hands who'd quit after visits to town. Aldrich looked at all of it without touching anything for a long moment. "You want to file a formal sabotage complaint," he said. "Yes," Delilah said, "against persons unknown, with evidence suggesting direction from Porter Gillespie." Suggesting isn't proving. "I know that. I'm not asking you to convict anyone. I'm asking you to record what was found, when, by whom, and what physical evidence was recovered." She met his eyes over his glasses. I'm asking you to make it official before someone else comes in here and tells a different version." Aldrich looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Riker, who was standing slightly behind her and to the left, which was where he'd been standing for most of the past 8 months. Present, solid, not blocking anything. "Has Mr. Gillespie contacted this office recently?" Riker asked. Aldrich was quiet for just a beat too long. "That's a yes," Delilah said. "I can't speak to other parties' business with this office," Aldrich said carefully. "What I can tell you is that any filing made today will be date-stamped today, and the record will stand as filed." "Then let's file," Delilah said. It took 2 hours. Aldrich was thorough, which she'd counted on. He cataloged each piece of evidence, noted the descriptions, cross-referenced the iron pin stamp against the county's supplier registry, which was a document she hadn't known existed and which showed, in dry official language, that the specific pattern of stamp belonged to a smithy in Merton County that supplied primarily to 2 large operations in the valley. One of those operations was listed by name: Gillespie Ranching and Land Holdings. Aldrich made a note of this without comment, in the same even hand he used for everything. On the ride home, in the long flat light of late afternoon, Riker said, "It's still not proof." "No," Delilah said, "but it's a record, and records have a way of accumulating until they become something nobody can argue with." He was quiet for a while. "Do you think he'll push further?" he asked. "I think he'll recalculate," she said. "Men like Gillespie are tactical. When the cost of a thing starts exceeding what the thing is worth, they stop." She looked at the road ahead. "We just made it more expensive." The reservoir reached distribution threshold on the 14th day after the storm. Delilah knew it before anyone told her because she'd been checking the gauge markers she and Birch had set in the channel walls. And when she went out on the morning of the 14th day, the water was sitting exactly where she'd calculated it needed to be. She stood at the main distribution gate, old iron, stiff from 20 years of disuse, but intact. And she put both hands on the handle and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back to the ranch and got Riker. "Come with me," she said. "Where?" "Just come." He came. They rode to the distribution point and she showed him the gauge and he looked at it and then at her. "It's ready," she said. He put his hand on the gate handle beside hers. She hadn't asked him to do that. He just did. They opened it together, which was harder than it looked. The mechanism was stiff and fought them. And then it gave and the water moved out of the reservoir and into the distribution channel and began its way toward the 6 properties that had been waiting for it. She had not cried in a long time. She did not cry now, but something in her chest did something that she would have had difficulty explaining to anyone who asked. "There it goes," Riker said. "There it goes," she agreed. The water reached Horace Webb's east field first, by virtue of gravity and channel distance, and Webb was there when it arrived because Delilah had sent Birch ahead to tell him when to watch for it. He was standing at the edge of his field with his hat in his hands when the water came through the channel and spread into the dry earth, and he watched it for a long time before he said anything. What he said eventually to Birch was, "She actually did it." Birch, who had been there for most of it and whose arms still ached from the canyon work, said, "Yes, sir, she did." Lena Cord's farm got water 2 days later. Trevelyan's sheep pasture the day after that. Each time, the people who received it came to understand something that is easy to say and hard to fully absorb until you see it, that a thing which seems impossible is often just difficult, and difficult is a different category entirely. Doss, the nervous small rancher who had contributed 1 man to the work, rode out to the Boone Ranch on the day his water came through and stood on the porch and waited until Delilah came to the door. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I should have given you 2 men," he said. "Maybe 3. I was scared the whole thing wouldn't work and I didn't want to lose the labor if it failed." He turned his hat. "I was thinking about myself." "You weren't the only one," she said. "No, but I should have been braver about it." He looked at her directly in a way that cost him something. She could see it costing him. "I'm sorry I wasn't." She looked at him. He was not a bad man. He was a frightened one, which was a different thing, and she had spent enough time being frightened herself to know the difference mattered. Next time there's something that needs doing, she said. Give 3 men. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. He left. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about the word ma'am, which people had never said to her before this year, and how strange it still felt, and how she was slowly and imperfectly learning to accept it as something she'd earned rather than something being given to her by mistake. Burl Hackett was a harder case. His south pasture got water through the distribution system on the 5th day, because the channel went where the channel went regardless of what Hackett thought about anything, and the water rights were common rights that even Hackett's stubbornness couldn't override. He didn't come to thank her. She didn't expect him to. What he did, about 2 weeks after the water came through, was repair the fence line between his property and Riker's, not with any announcement. He just sent 2 men out one morning, and they fixed the gap that had been cut in December and strung new wire along a section that had been sagging, and when Cal came back and reported it, Delilah sat with the information for a while before deciding what she thought. He's not going to apologize, Riker said. No, she said. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things. Some, she said, less than it might have. She set down what she'd been reading. Hackett is who he is. People like that. They don't come around completely, but they adjust. The fence being fixed is him adjusting. She paused. I'll take an adjusted Hackett over an unrepentant one. Riker looked at her with that look she'd learned over 8 months meant he was thinking about her specifically rather than the situation. You're more patient than I am. I've had more practice needing to be, she said. Porter Gillespie did not disappear quietly, because men like him rarely do. What he did was contract in a way that people noticed. Fewer expansive gestures, fewer public pronouncements about what was best for the valley, fewer offers on neighboring land. The formal complaint at the county office had not produced a prosecution, because the evidence was suggestive rather than conclusive, but it had produced something nearly as effective, a record that anyone could read, and a reputation that had acquired a new and unflattering dimension. The Smithy in Merton County, when a county investigator made a routine inquiry, confirmed that the iron fittings were from their stock, and that the order had been placed by a man using a Gillespie ranching account. The man himself was never identified with certainty. Gillespie told the investigator he had no knowledge of any employees visiting the canyon area, which was the kind of answer that is technically deniable and practically transparent. Nothing was formally charged, but the commissioner's office issued a finding that the sabotage of common water infrastructure was a serious matter under the original land grant agreements, and that any future interference with the reservoir system or its distribution channels would carry significant legal penalties. The finding was read into the public record at a county meeting. Gillespie was present at that meeting. He sat in the 3rd row, and his face did not move much. Delilah was also present, in the back, and she watched his face and thought, this is what it looks like when a man who has been winning for a long time has to sit still and hear something he can't argue with. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt tired mostly, and a little sad in the complicated way you feel sad about people who choose to be the worst version of themselves when they didn't have to. He still had his land. He still had his money. He was just smaller now, in the way that men who have built their size by diminishing others become smaller when that mechanism stops working. The town gathering was Margaret Deaver's idea. She came to Delilah in late August with the proposal, a community meeting, not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of the drought, of the reservoir, of what the valley had almost lost, and what had been done to prevent it. I don't want it to be about me, Delilah said immediately. It's not going to be about you, Margaret said. It's going to be about what happened. You're part of what happened. A significant part, Riker said from across the room. I don't need Delilah. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to say hard things. You have spent your entire life making yourself small so that other people would be more comfortable. This is one time I am asking you to let people see what you actually did, not for vanity, because it matters what story this valley tells itself about how it survived. Delilah was quiet for a long time. All right, she said finally. The gathering was held at the Webb farm, same barn as the first meeting, but with considerably more people. Nearly 40 came. Some of them were people who had been part of the reservoir effort from the start. Some were people who had sat back and waited. A few, and this was what surprised her most, were people from town who had nothing to do with any of it, who had come because word had traveled and they wanted to see for themselves what had happened. Cora Aldridge was there. She sat near the front, straight-backed, her expression composed in a way that could have been many things. She and Delilah did not speak, but at one point their eyes met across the room and Cora gave her a small nod, barely perceptible, the kind of acknowledgement that costs something and is offered anyway. Delilah returned it. That was all. It was enough. Webb spoke first because it was his barn and because he had a plain way with words that people listened to. He described the drought. He described what Delilah had brought him on that June afternoon with the maps and the numbers and the idea that seemed impossible until it wasn't. He was not sentimental about it. Horace Webb was not a sentimental man. But he was precise, and precision in that room, with those people, carried its own weight. Lena Cord spoke after him. Trevelyan, Cal Deaver, Birch, who surprised everyone including himself by standing up and saying something unscripted about the canyon work that made Margaret laugh and several other people nod. When it came to Delilah, she stood at the front of the barn and looked at the 40 faces looking back at her, some friendly, some curious, some still complicated, and she thought about what she wanted to say. She had not prepared remarks because prepared remarks had always felt dishonest to her, the kind of performance that substituted for actual communication. She said, "This valley was going to lose a lot of what it has. We all knew that by June, and most of us were starting to understand there was no good solution, just different bad ones." She paused. "What I want people to understand is that I didn't solve the drought. The reservoir was already there, the channels were already built, the water rights already existed. Everything needed to make this work was already present in this valley for 70 years, and nobody used it because nobody went looking." Another pause. "That's worth thinking about. Not as a criticism, as a question. What else is here that we're not using because it's easier to assume it's gone?" The barn was quiet. "I also want to say something that might be uncomfortable." She looked at the room steadily. "Some of you made this harder than it had to be. Not the drought. I mean, the other thing. The months before we got to the drought." She didn't point at anyone. She didn't need to. "I understand why. People make judgments about people, and the judgments feel true even when they're not, and it takes a long time and sometimes a crisis to revise them." She stopped. "I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking that next time someone in this valley is dismissed because of how they look, or where they come from, or who they married, you remember that you almost missed the solution to the worst drought in 20 years because you were busy deciding who was worth listening to." The silence lasted a few seconds. Then Webb started clapping, which was not something Horace Webb did easily, and once Webb started, the rest of the room followed, and Delilah stood at the front of the barn and received it with as much grace as she could manage, which was imperfect, because she was not good at being seen and probably never would be entirely. The ride home that evening was quiet. The valley in late August had a particular quality. The light going golden earlier, the nights cooler, the sense of summer not quite done but beginning its accounting. The reservoir was full. The distribution channels were running. The smaller properties that had come through the drought were already thinking about what the next season could look like with a reliable water source, and several of them had come to Delilah in the past weeks to talk about expanding what the cooperative system could do. She was thinking about that, about what could be built properly with the right agreements in place from the start. She had ideas. She always had ideas. That had never been the problem. The problem had always been whether anyone would listen to them. Riker rode beside her and didn't say anything for a long time. He was good at that. It was one of the things she'd understood about him early and had kept understanding, the way you keep understanding something about a person the longer you know them. That his silences were never empty. They were just him being with her in a way that didn't need decoration. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "That first morning, in the store, when you asked me." She looked at the road ahead. "How long had you actually been thinking about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since about March," he said. "March." That was 8 months before he asked. "What happened in March?" "You caught an error in my grain order," he said. A supplier error, not mine. You caught it before I paid, and you showed me without making me feel like an idiot about it. He paused. I stood there watching you explain it, and I thought, that's who I want to be thinking with. He glanced at her. It sounds simple. It doesn't sound simple at all, she said. No, he agreed. I don't suppose it does. She thought about March. She had no memory of the specific incident, which was the strange thing. The moment that had changed the direction of her life was a moment she'd experienced as routine. She'd caught a supplier error. She'd shown him without fuss. She'd gone back to stocking shelves. That was the thing about being overlooked for a long time, she thought. You stopped expecting the small things to matter. You did them because they needed doing, and you moved on because there was always more to do. And sometimes those small things were adding up in someone's mind without your knowledge, building into something that would arrive one ordinary morning and change everything. I'm glad you asked, she said. I'm glad you said yes, he said. She looked out at the valley. The light was low and warm, and the ridge to the east was purple-shadowed, and the grass, what was left of it after the drought, was catching what remained of the day's sun in a way that made it look briefly golden. It was not a beautiful valley in the conventional sense, too dry, too rocky, the hills at the wrong scale, but it was hers, or she was part of it, which might be the same thing, and it held within it the water she'd helped find, moving right now through old channels towards 6 properties where people were going to plant and tend and make it through the winter. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago in the 2-room house with her books and her careful management of other people's comfort. She thought about flour on her hands and a question she hadn't expected and the particular courage, because it was courage she could see that now, of saying yes to something when every sensible instinct was screaming that sensible women didn't get to have things like this. She had not become a different person. That was what nobody outside would understand. She was the same person she'd always been, the same person who caught supplier errors and kept accounts and listened when people forgot she was there. What had changed was not her, but the space around her, the amount of room she was being given to actually do what she'd always been capable of doing. That was what the town had nearly missed, not some hidden talent that emerged under pressure, just a woman who'd been there all along, doing the work, waiting for someone to ask the right question. She was still waiting, in a sense, still learning the ranch, still figuring out the limits of what she could build here, still finding places where she was wrong or slow or out of her depth. She had made mistakes in the past year, small ones and 1 or 2 that had cost them real time and money. She had lost her patience on 3 separate occasions in ways she wasn't proud of, once with a hand who had deserved it, and twice with Riker who hadn't. She was not the person the town gathering had described when Webb spoke. She was something messier and more uncertain and more tired than that. But she was here, and the water was running, and the valley that had decided she was not worth much was going to eat through the winter on work she had done, and they were going to plant in the spring with water she had found for them. And some of them would know that, and some of them would never fully reckon with it, and that was simply the human reality of things, that the accounting is never quite complete, that credit distributes unevenly, that the world does not resolve itself into clean lessons. She had learned over the course of this year to make peace with that imperfection, not to accept injustice as permanent, but to stop requiring justice as a condition of moving forward. You did the work because the work mattered. You did it because the people downstream from the reservoir needed the water regardless of whether they'd been kind to you. You did it because you could, and you were there, and someone had to. That was the thing. Someone had to. And she had. The ranch came into view as they crested the last rise. The bunkhouse lamp already lit, smoke from the kitchen chimney where Birch had apparently decided to attempt supper, the corrals in the barn, and the long, low line of the house where she had rearranged the kitchen on her first morning, and would continue rearranging things, probably, for years to come. Birch is cooking, Riker said. I know, she said. We should hurry. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the small, almost laugh she'd gotten used to, but a real one, sudden and unguarded. And it sounded good in the evening air. It sounded like something she intended to keep hearing, and she nudged her horse into a canter and let the golden light of the valley's first good season come up around her and carry her the rest of the way home.